The Medal of Honor, the highest decoration that the United States can bestow upon its military heroes. The men and the one woman who have earned this award perform deeds above and beyond the call of duty. Driven by their own sense of honor, displaying gallantry and valor that they may not have even known they possessed, they risk their lives to save their comrades and to strike a blow for freedom. Since 1941, more than half of the awards were given posthumously. Such is the nature of these heroic actions that most do not survive them. Over the century and a half since its first creation, the Medal of Honor has grown in status and prestige. But the stories of even the earliest recipients provide an inspiration to all who wear the uniform. Indeed, they inspire us all. Who were those first heroes? And how did they launch a tradition of sacrifice, valor, gallantry, and honor? The history of the Medal of Honor begins almost 80 years before the award was first created. General George Washington created the Badge of Military Merit in 1782. This badge was the predecessor of the Purple Heart.
Whenever any singularly meritorious action is performed, the author of it shall be permitted to wear on his facings, over the left breast, the figure of a heart in purple cloth.
Washington stressed that before this award for acts of unusual gallantry and extraordinary fidelity and essential service could be bestowed, the Commander-in-Chief must be presented with incontestable proof of the action earning the honor. And he noted that
those gallant men who are thus designated will on all occasions be treated with particular confidence and consideration.
Washington's Badge of Military Merit is only known to have been awarded to a handful of men. After the Revolutionary War, the badge essentially disappeared, to be revived as the Purple Heart in 1932. During the Mexican-American War, the Certificate of Merit was introduced. Rather than a medal, this was a paper award. Though it did include a raise in pay of $2 a month, this award was not truly a decoration, since it could not be worn on a soldier's uniform. And again, this award did not continue beyond the war for which it was created. It is a bitter irony that our nation's highest award for courage and gallantry in the face of the enemy was created during a war in which our enemies were our own countrymen. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles asked Iowa Senator James W. Grimes to introduce a bill to promote the efficiency of the Navy through the creation of Medals of Honor. President Lincoln signed it into law on December 21st, 1861. The new law authorized the creation of 200 medals to be awarded to petty officers, seamen, landsmen, and Marines, as shall distinguish themselves by their gallantry in action and other seaman-like qualities during the present war. Not to be outdone, the Army saw to it that similar legislation would create an award for its soldiers. In July 1862, Lincoln signed a bill that stated,
"The President of the United States is hereby authorized to cause 2,000 Medals of Honor to be prepared with suitable emblematic devices, and to direct that the same be presented in the name of the Congress to such non-commissioned officers and privates as shall most distinguish themselves by their gallantry in action and other soldier-like qualities during the present insurrection."
Later, commissioned officers would also be eligible for the award. As with the Badge of Military Merit and the Certificate of Merit, the original Medal of Honor was not expected to outlast the war for which it was created, the present insurrection. During the Civil War, there were no other medals available for recognizing exceptional actions by members of the armed forces, and the legislation did not define gallantry in action to indicate that it meant at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, as it does today. As a result, at times the award was bestowed for actions that were less than extraordinary. The most extreme example involved almost 900 awards. At the end of June 1863, a regiment of volunteers from Maine were stationed in Washington, D.C. as General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army was invading Pennsylvania. The members of the 27th Maine were nearing the end of their 9-month commitment to service and preparing to leave. Fearful that the loss of this regiment would put the capital in jeopardy, Secretary of War Stanton promised a Medal of Honor to all members of the 27th Maine who remained to fight. 309 of the 27th Maine's 864 men remained in Washington to defend the city. But due to a clerical error, all 864 men were sent a Medal of Honor by mail. Events such as this would lead to calls for tightening of the criteria in the years leading up to World War I. But that was still decades in the future, when the first recipients were decorated by Lincoln's Secretary of War in March 1863. Those men were the survivors of a daring mission into the Confederacy to sabotage a railroad. A civilian spy, James Andrews, conceived the plan. Along with another civilian and 22 volunteers from 3 Ohio regiments, Andrews planned to capture a Confederate train bound from Atlanta, Georgia, to Chattanooga, Tennessee. They would then take the train to Chattanooga, tearing up track and blowing bridges along the way. In groups of 3 and 4, the men made their way to Marietta, Georgia, where they would board the train. Their cover story was that they were looking for a Confederate regiment out of Kentucky, which they wished to join. 2 of the men were forced to join a Confederate unit near Jasper, Tennessee, to avoid blowing their cover. 2 others overslept on the morning they were to board the train in Marietta. But Andrews and 19 others boarded on time. They waited to make their move at the train's breakfast stop in Big Shanty, Georgia. They selected Big Shanty because it lacked a telegraph station. Their initial seizure of the train was a success. They decoupled the locomotive and 3 boxcars from the remainder of the train and were off before anyone realized what was happening. But the train's conductor, William Fuller, saw the train pull out, and the great locomotive chase was on. At stops along the journey, Andrews and his men cut telegraph lines and disrupted rail track. But tearing up the track took time, and Andrews decided not to spare that time at a few key points. The result was that conductor Fuller was able to commandeer other trains and stay hot on their trail. Just a few miles from his destination in Chattanooga, Andrews' locomotive ran out of fuel. Andrews knew his plan had failed. He called out to his men,
"Jump off and scatter, every man for himself."
But every man was captured within 2 weeks. Andrews and 7 others would be hanged as spies. Following the execution, 8 others would escape, and then the remaining 6 were exchanged for Confederate prisoners. The survivors of the raid met with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton in March 1863. Corporal William Pittenger, one of the 6 prisoners exchanged, later wrote about the meeting with Secretary Stanton.
The secretary conversed with us most affably for some time. Then going into another room, he brought out 6 medals and presented them to us, saying that they were the first ever given to private soldiers. Jacob Parrott, the boy who endured the terrible beating, received, as he well deserved, the first one. He next presented us with $100 each and ordered all arrearages to be paid and the money and the value of the arms taken from us to be refunded. This was not all. He requested Governor Todd to promote each of us to first lieutenants in the Ohio troops, and, if he failed to do so, promised to give us that grade in the regular army. We then received furloughs to visit our homes and left his presence profoundly convinced that republics are not always ungrateful. We were then escorted to the executive mansion and had a most pleasing interview with our noble president. His kindness was equal to that of the secretary.
Most of those hanged as spies were awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. James Andrews, the daring spy who conceived and led the mission, was not among them, since he was not a member of the armed forces. The soldiers from Andrews' raid were the first to actually receive their Medals of Honor. But the first action that would earn the medal occurred 2 years earlier, before the award even existed. On February 13th, 1861, Bernard Irwin, an assistant army surgeon, led 14 men on a mission to rescue over 60 soldiers who had been captured by the Apache. Though the Medal of Honor had not yet been created, he would be awarded it for this action upon his retirement, over 30 years later. Just as Bernard Irwin and Jacob Parrott could arguably each be called the first recipients of the Medal of Honor, 2 other men could each claim the distinction of the first African-American recipient. The first to physically receive the award was Robert Blake. Blake was a slave in South Carolina until he was taken in by Union forces in 1862. He then volunteered to serve on Navy ships, eventually serving as steward on the gunboat USS Marblehead. On Christmas Day, 1863, the Marblehead was shelled by Confederate artillery on Johns Island, South Carolina. An explosion knocked Blake to the deck, and when he rose, he saw the powder boy who had been manning a gun had been killed. Although he was not serving in a combat role, Blake took over the powder boy's job, carrying gunpowder boxes to the artillery loaders throughout the battle. For his actions under fire, Robert Blake received the Medal of Honor 4 months later in April 1864. But the African American whose action was first to earn the Medal of Honor did so in an engagement that remains famous to this day. The 1989 movie Glory called America's attention again to the heroism of the 54th Massachusetts, one of the regiments of the new U.S. colored troops. The 54th, including Sergeant William Carney, played a major role in the assault on Fort Wagner in Charleston, South Carolina. Carney, like Blake, was a former slave. But on July 18, 1863, he was Sergeant Carney, honored to be among those spearheading the assault on Fort Wagner. Carney later described that day.
We were all ready for the charge, and the regiment started to its feet. We had got but a short distance when we were opened upon with musketry, shell, grape, and canister, which mowed down our men right and left. As the color bearer became disabled, I threw away my gun and seized the colors, making my way to the head of the column. As we ascended the breastworks, the volleys of grape shots which came from right and left and musketry in front mowed the men down as a scythe would do. In less than 20 minutes, I found myself alone, struggling upon the ramparts while all around me were the dead and wounded, lying upon one another. Here, I said, I cannot go into the fort alone. So I halted and knelt down, holding the flag in my hand. While there, musket balls and grape shots were flying all around me. As they struck, the sand would fly in my face. I knew my position was a critical one. I wound the colors around the staff and made my way down the parapet into the ditch, which was without water when I crossed it before, but was now filled with water that came up to my waist. In rising to see if I could determine my course to the rear, the bullet I now carry in my body came whizzing like a mosquito, and I was shot. Not being prostrated by the shot, I continued my course, yet had not gone far before I was struck by a second shot. Soon after, I saw a man coming towards me, and he helped me to the rear. Now then, he said, let me take the colors and carry them for you. My reply was that I would not give them to any man unless he belonged to the 54th Regiment. So we pressed on, but did not go far before I was wounded in the head. When we finally reached my regiment, the men cheered me and the flag. My reply was, boys, I only did my duty. The old flag never touched the ground.
As was often the case with Civil War recipients, it was decades before Sergeant Carney received the medal he earned in 1863. It was presented to him in 1900, 8 years before his death. In the Civil War, flags were used to help communicate with and coordinate troops, and their loss was both a tremendous blow to morale and a potentially disastrous breach in communications. Like William Carney, many other Civil War recipients of the Medal of Honor earned the award for their defense of the flag or colors. Men like Corporal Alexander Scott of the 10th Vermont Regiment. On July 9th, 1864, Corporal Scott's regiment was among the outnumbered Union forces that stood in the way of Confederate General Jubal Early's army as it moved on Washington, D.C. Early's army had just defeated Union troops in Frederick, Maryland. Standing between Early's 14,000 men and the Union capital was General Lew Wallace and his force of about 6,000. Wallace's army needed to delay Early's long enough for reinforcements to reach Washington and Baltimore. To achieve that delay, they would guard the bridges and fords crossing the Monocacy River. Most of Wallace's soldiers were 100 Days men who had just enlisted for 100 days for the specific purpose of repelling this invasion. They had not yet been in combat, and they faced veteran troops. But they received last-minute reinforcements from a couple of veteran regiments from the Union 6th Corps, including the 10th Vermont. Corporal Alexander Scott served in Company D of the 10th Vermont, where he was assigned to the color guard. During the battle, Corporal Scott was carrying the state flag. While the regiment was taking heavy fire, Scott saw his sergeant, who carried the national colors, fall out of and drop to the rear, which meant inevitable capture. Corporal Scott, then nearly overpowered by the heat and fatigue, picked up the national flag and carried both colors during the remainder of the battle. The first lieutenant of Company D would also earn a Medal of Honor during the battle at Monocacy. Lieutenant George Davis and 75 of his men from the 10th Vermont had been placed with a portion of a Maryland regiment commanded by a Captain Charles Brown. Brown and his 200 men were inexperienced, having just recently entered service. Davis later described his experiences on July 9th, 1864.
Our orders were to hold the two bridges across the river at all hazard and prevent the enemy from crossing. Other Union forces were on the south bank of the river. We were the only Union troops on the north side, confronted with General Ramsey's division of Confederate troops. When the enemy advanced about 3:30 a.m. along the pike from Frederick City, Captain Brown allowed them to come within 15 or 20 rods of our position, thinking they were Union troops because dressed in blue clothing which they had recently captured at Martinsburg. I stoutly protested, telling him our friends were behind us. He was convinced when one of his men was killed and several wounded. Then he turned to me in disgust and insisted upon my taking command. I assumed command instantly, brought up my 10th Vermonters to this point, and after a severe fight of about 1 hour, the enemy retired. About 11 a.m., a second and much severer attack was made upon our right and rear, by which they intended to cut us out, take us prisoners, cross the railroad bridge, and turn General Ricketts' position. Anticipating a flank attack, I had, on assuming command, sent pickets up and down the river, who warned me of this movement that was entirely hidden from my view, so that I drew back my men to the west end of the railroad bridge, faced to the north, repelled the attack, then resumed my former position on the pike, which we held until the final retreat. The third and last attack began about 3:30 p.m. The situation was critical. The enemy came upon us with such overwhelming numbers and desperation that it seemed we should be swept into the river. Nevertheless, we fought for over an hour and kept back a much larger force than ours.
As Lieutenant Davis' citation for the Medal of Honor notes, his defense of the two bridges against repeated assaults of superior numbers materially delayed Early's advance on Washington. Some men, like Carney and Scott, earned their Medal of Honor by protecting their colors. Others, like Davis, Baker, and the soldiers participating in Andrews' raid, earned their medals through extraordinarily brave actions in the face of enemy fire or capture. And still others earned their medals by placing their own lives at great hazard in order to save the lives of fellow soldiers. Men like First Lieutenant John H. Patterson of the 11th U.S. Infantry. On May 5, 1864, Lieutenant Patterson was with his regiment in the dense underbrush of the wilderness of Spotsylvania County, Virginia. Union pickets observed Confederate troops heading up the Orange Courthouse Turnpike. They constructed earthworks for defense and hunkered down. Major General Warren was reluctant to attack, fearing that the Confederate position would allow them to flank Warren's 5th Corps. But Union General Meade ordered Warren to attack without delay. Warren's concerns proved correct, as the Confederates were able to fire upon his front and right flank. The 11th Regiment's Lieutenant Colonel William Powell later wrote of the fighting that day.
The tremendous roll of firing excluded all of the sounds. Here and there, a man toppled over and disappeared, or springing to his feet, pressed his hands to the wounded part and ran to the rear. Men's faces were sweaty black from biting cartridges, and a sort of grim ferocity seemed to be creeping into the actions and appearance of everyone within the limited range of vision. The tops of the bushes were being cut away by the laden missiles that tore through them, and occasional glimpses of gray, phantom-like forms crouching under the bank of cloud were obtained.
Sparks flew from guns as the powder was ignited. On that dry day, the sparks turned into a blaze in the underbrush. Dead leaves and twigs fed the flames, which quickly roared out of control. One soldier, wounded and lying along the Orange Courthouse Turnpike, wrote,
Suddenly, to the horror of the living, fire was seen creeping over the ground, fed by dead leaves which were thick. All who could move tried to get beyond the pike which the fire could not cross. Some were overtaken by the flames when they had crawled but a few feet, and some when they had almost reached the road. The ground, which had been strewn with dead and wounded, was in a few hours blackened, with no distinguishable figure upon it.
In the midst of that fiery scene, an officer of the 11th Regiment went down along the skirmish line. Lieutenant Wright Staples had been shot in the stomach and couldn't rise. Lieutenant Patterson picked Staples up and carried him several hundred yards to a place of safety. Unfortunately, Staples did not survive his wound, but Patterson would eventually receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. As with William Carney, it would take over 30 years before Patterson would be awarded the medal. Patterson's daughter described the day her father received notice of the award in 1897.
I remember the day my father's medal came. We were sitting around the dining table at our noon meal. It was the great day of the week, the day of the Eastern mail. My father came into the table with a letter in his hand, a long envelope with black printing in the corner. I was looking at him as he opened it. His face went very red and then drained slowly white. He looked up. Something seemed the matter with his throat. He could not speak. Then he reached over our heads and handed the letter to our grandmother. She read it, and her first look was for us. I remember her voice. "Children," she said, "your father has been awarded the Medal of Honor by the Congress of the United States." Her manner was formal and unfamiliar. My father recovered himself. "You are not to speak of it," he said, with the sternness he affected when deeply moved. "You are never by any chance to refer to it."
It was not at all unusual for Medal of Honor recipients from the Civil War to wait decades before being honored for their valor. In fact, as late as February 2010, the Secretary of War approved the posthumous award of the Medal of Honor to First Lieutenant Alonzo Cushing, a battery commander of the 4th U.S. Artillery Regiment. During the Battle of Gettysburg, on July 3, 1863, young Lieutenant Cushing gave his last full measure in defense of the Union as he stood to face Pickett's charge. Despite injuries from shrapnel that left his intestines hanging outside his body, Cushing refused to leave the front.
"No, I stay right here, and fight it out or die in the attempt.
Cushing took a bullet to the head during Pickett's charge. He had remained in command of his artillery for 90 minutes after his first serious wound. Cushing was cited for his bravery, but was not immediately recommended for a Medal of Honor. He was nominated by Senator Russ Feingold in 2002, and his award was approved by the Secretary of the Army in 2010. Another Civil War recipient of the Medal of Honor had a difficult time receiving and holding the award. Dr. Mary Walker, the only woman to ever be awarded the Medal of Honor, was a civilian surgeon working for the U.S. Army on contract during the Civil War. Dr. Walker tried to join the Union Army as a medical officer, but was denied a commission. For 2 years, she worked as an unpaid field surgeon before being awarded a commission as a civilian assistant surgeon. Dr. Walker served at the Battle of Bull Run, near the front lines of the Battle of Fredericksburg, and in Chattanooga after the Battle of Chickamauga, and more. She was captured as a spy and held as a prisoner of war for 4 months in 1864. After the war, Dr. Walker was recommended for the Medal of Honor by Generals William Tecumseh Sherman and George Henry Thomas. President Andrew Johnson awarded her the medal for her service at the First Battle of Bull Run. Her citation notes, "Whereas it appears from official reports that Dr. Mary E. Walker, a graduate of medicine, has rendered valuable service to the government, and her efforts have been earnest and untiring in a variety of ways, and has devoted herself with much patriotic zeal to the sick and wounded soldiers, both in the field and hospitals, to the detriment of her own health, and has also endured hardships as a prisoner of war 4 months in a southern prison while acting as contract surgeon, and whereas, by reason of her not being a commissioned officer in the military service, a brevet or honorary rank cannot, under existing laws, be conferred upon her, and whereas, in the opinion of the President, an honorable recognition of her services and sufferings should be made, it is ordered that a testimonial thereof shall be hereby made and given to the said Dr. Mary E. Walker, and that the usual Medal of Honor for meritorious services be given her." The Medal of Honor would change over the decades to come. In 1917, as part of an effort to tighten the criteria for the nation's highest military honor, over 900 names would be struck from the official roll of recipients of the Army Medal of Honor. Dr. Mary Walker's name would be among those. Hers would be struck from the rolls because she was a civilian rather than a member of the armed forces. The members of the 27th Maine, some of whom had stayed beyond their enlistment to help defend Washington, D.C., would also be struck, since many of those had been given in error, and none of the actions seemed truly above and beyond the call of duty. Dr. Walker would eventually have her medal officially restored, posthumously, by President Jimmy Carter. But her case was a rare exception, along with a handful of others. But although 900 names from the Civil War era were stricken, there still remain more recipients of the Medal of Honor from that war than from both World Wars, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. Over 1,500 men and 1 woman earned the Medal of Honor during the war between North and South. Perhaps some of those actions would have merited a different medal if there had been one to give. But the long list of names and medal citations is nonetheless inspiring. Men like First Lieutenant Frank Baldwin of the 19th Michigan Infantry. Lieutenant Baldwin led his company in a countercharge at Peachtree Creek, Georgia, on July 12, 1864. Under heavy fire and ahead of his own men, he broke through the Confederate line on his own. He captured and brought back 2 commissioned officers and Naval Quartermaster Robert Anderson. During the attack on Charleston, Anderson used his own body to shield his commanding officer from shrapnel. And men like Corporal Andrew Tomlin of the U.S. Marine Corps. During the assault on Fort Fisher in January 1865, Corporal Tomlin unhesitatingly advanced under a withering fire of musketry into an open plain close to the fort and assisted a wounded comrade to a place of safety. These men and Dr. Walker provided an example of sacrifice, gallantry, and valor to which American servicemen would aspire for centuries to follow. It was their example that would bring greater esteem to the Medal of Honor than could have been expected by those who first conceived it. As the U.S. military changed and evolved over the coming decades and wars, the medal would evolve as well. But there would always prove to be a few men who would demonstrate gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. Men of extraordinary valor, upon whom a grateful nation would bestow the Medal of Honor.